Hi everyone, welcome to Manager IQ's Manager Skills Corner podcast. Manager IQ's mission is to provide an online space where managers can access all the resources, learnings and tools to build their manager toolkit, and also to provide you with a community of managers to lean on. This podcast is designed to bring experts in specific areas of management to share their knowledge and experience with the Manager IQ community. We share tips and tricks which you can implement into your management practice. For more information about Manager IQ and our products, check out our website www.manageriq.com. Now, let's check out today's episode. I would like to welcome Dr. Brock Bastian to the Manager Skills Corner podcast to discuss psychological safety in the workplace. Brock is a professor of social psychology at the University of Melbourne, author of The Other Side of Happiness, Embracing a More Fearless Approach to Living, and consults across industry and government, translating scientific knowledge into practical insights and strategies. Brock has a strong interest in understanding the various social and cultural factors that impact on decision-making and well-being. He has published over 150 peer-reviewed journal articles, and his work has been featured in outlets such as The Economist, The New Yorker, Time, Forbes, New Scientist, Scientific American, and Harvard Business Review. In his consulting, Brock brings scientific insights on culture, communication, well-being, and behavioral ethics to address a range of organizational challenges. From speaking to senior leaders of large organizations, providing accessible workshops for frontline staff, Brock has a unique capacity to communicate scientific knowledge in a practical and accessible manner. Whether it's building more psychological safe teams or providing best practice advice on managing stress and mental health, as a social psychologist, Brock has a strong focus on early intervention and prevention. Brock is a TEDx speaker and has provided keynotes at many of the top universities in the world and for a range of organizations and industry events. Welcome to the podcast today, Brock. What is psychological safety?
Yeah, well, psychological safety is, it's really a cultural dimension or a way of thinking about culture. And of course, culture is something that often people think is a bit, abstract and amorphous and something you can't really understand or access or measure. But I mean, I think it's actually quite different to that. Culture is something that we can study and we can assess, and I think we are also very, very sensitive to identifying or feeling or being able to, I guess, understand the kinds of cultures that we're surrounded by. And psychological safety is a way of describing this particular aspect of a culture where it is really about that idea that people feel safe to be able to take interpersonal risks, to speak up, to be able to offer ideas, ask questions. A big part of it is also about being able to be human, so to acknowledge error and omissions and mistakes, and to feel that it's safe to be able to do that. I think one of the elements of the term itself that often gets perhaps misused or perhaps even is perhaps misplaced in some ways is the term safety. So it feels as though it should be a safe place. And whilst it is about creating a safe place for people, it's not about just simply protecting people. In fact, it's about creating an environment where people can actually feel very challenged, where people can have some pretty difficult conversations, candid conversations. Again, that interpersonal risk-taking part, where I can front up and actually have a really uncomfortable, difficult conversation with you, not because I just want to create discomfort for you or because I want to make your life hard. I don't think that's a psychologically safe space, but because I think that that's actually really important. There's something that I think that we need to understand, or that perhaps I feel I need to communicate to you in that space, and I feel that I can take that risk with you and do that because it's important to do so, and I feel safe to be able to take that risk. I think that's really that particular, I think that interpersonal risk taking is a really important part of the definition.
Yeah, thank you so much for touching on that, because I did mention before when we're having our chat pre the podcast around psychological safety seems such an extreme word, and it seems scary to managers. How do I do this big thing? But like you're saying, it's part of culture. It's about how do we make people feel comfortable, safe, wanting to have those challenging, difficult conversations, where they don't feel like something's going to happen at the back of it. So having this really exciting, creative environment environment, I guess, is what
Yeah.
you're trying to do, which makes it feel that much more easier to obtain from a manager's perspective.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it is about, yeah, I mean, it is about having that creative environment, being able to make those sort of, I mean, it's, we know it's very important for innovation in that sense and performance. Again, Google identified it as one of the most, its number one attribute of its most successful teams. So it certainly enables those sorts of, those sorts of conversations, those sorts of contributions. But also, I think it's it can be really important for dealing with all sorts of risks as well. I think it's the sort of environment where if you want to, or if you need to sort of hear about something, if you need to say something, if you need to identify a problem or a risk across the board, and again, this might be about risks to business, it could be about risks to people. Again, it could be about physical risks, it could be about psychosocial risks, but that capacity to feel that, it's safe to be able to identify those things, have those conversations as well. I think that open and honest kind of communication is really critical to creating that kind of environment. Yeah.
And I think from an employee perspective, having an innovative team or a place where I can share my ideas or a place that we can have challenging conversations and someone's going to help me get to a spot that I never thought I would, that sounds like a great environment, so I would be excited about that. And a manager creating that kind of environment, I think, would be quite exciting as well.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned growth there, and I think that's exactly what it, I mean, there's no growth without some discomfort, I mean, there's nothing, I often say there's nothing that we know in terms of any system in the known human universe, well, not the known human universe, but in the known universe that humans inhabit, that grows, develops, gets better and stronger in a state of, comfort and equilibrium. It's always discomfort and disequilibrium where things are improving. So, I guess a psychologically safe culture is one where you can actually grow because you can be challenged, because you feel safe to challenge each other, on things that really matter and around issues or areas, ideas that allow you to reflect and consider different ways of doing things. So, I think growth and innovation, and personal growth is a really, really big part of it, or an outcome of it as well.
Yeah, and from my perspective as well, it's been, I guess, the term psychological safety has really come out, in the last few years, I say, I guess in my exposure to it. What is the background? How did this concept come to life? I guess for the viewers who might not know exactly how it came about.
Yeah, well, it actually dates back quite a few years in psychology, but became popularized by Amy Edmondson and a lot of her research. And so she sort of, I guess it was discussing a concept or a term that had been around, but really putting some shape to it with some of her work. And that was particularly around performance, understanding, how errors were managed, understanding how people were reporting those errors. Again, some of her work showed that, organisations that report more errors, omissions and mistakes are organisations that overall make fewer errors and omissions and mistakes because they're learning from those. And so, putting people in that learning zone where they are able to, I suppose, create interdependence and communicate openly around their work does actually, enhance performance. Again, sometimes I think that, people think, well, hang on, if we're going to allow people to make mistakes and talk about them, we're not really holding up to high standards. And, Amy makes that point that, well, actually, these things are orthogonal. They're independent, that you have, you need to allow people, give them the space, the room, the culture, the environment, the support to be able to perform well. And that includes, being a bit human around that too. So certainly Amy Edmondson's work has been a very important a starting point or sort of leverage point for the concept, even though it was around earlier. But then I think the thing that really threw it up into the collective consciousness was the Google research on its own organisation, or Project Aristotle. I think that was 2015, which then suddenly, I suppose, made people think, well, hang on, here's a list of things that we've always thought are really, really important, and psychological safety seems to be the number one here. So I think that's certainly elevated it. I mean, is it sort of entirely distinct from things we might talk about in other ways? I don't think so. I think that I think a high trust culture, a high trust environment is probably not I think the way that you talk around the concept of psychological safety gives it some emphasis and some definition, but I think there are elements of it that we would certainly and could capture with other concepts as well. Good communication, good support, high trust environments, all of those are really, I think, part of it. And at the end of the day, I mean, it is really about knowing how to create that environment where people like to come to work and can talk to each other and can communicate. And if you're thinking about what's the number one ingredient to create psychological safety, well, it's actually building relationships with people. I think that's the fastest way to do it. If you ask anybody, and I often do, do you have psychological safety in your teams? They'll say, oh yes, we have quite a bit of psychological safety in our teams. Well, the good teams do. Some teams don't, of course. Then you say, well, do you have psychological safety across your organisation? I'll say, oh, well, less so. Why? Because they know each other in the teams and they don't know people across the organisation. So I think relationships are a really, really important part of this. And so for a manager, thinking about, well, do you actually invest in creating high trust relationships with your people? And if you do, then it'd be pretty unlikely they don't feel psychologically safe with you.
Wow, that's great. That's a great tip and a really, I don't want to say simplify it because it's not a simple thing to create an environment where people, feel the trust and so forth. But if you are spending that time to getting to know your people, to finding out what their needs are, to seeing how you can help with those needs, it's going to take you a huge step forward to making them feel safe.
Yeah.
One of the things that I used to say in my team during our team meetings, I used to say, I don't want it to always be about, thank goodness it's Friday. I want it to be, thank goodness it's Monday, thank goodness it's Tuesday, whatever, every day, thank goodness, because I love what I do. I love the team I work in. I've got a sense of purpose, whatever the words are, because I wanted them to jump out of bed in the morning. It's something that I read. I think it was part of the Japanese culture. They try and find work that fits their purpose. So they jump out of bed, So I was trying to bring that into our team around how can we do that? And a lot of it ended up coming down to culture and how we can create really good relationships with our people.
Yeah, well, I've seen some data suggesting that culture is 10 times more important than remuneration when it comes to engagement and retention. So, people stick around not just for the money, but for the culture. And we also know that, the relatedness is a very important predictor of meaningfulness at work. So those relationships, the culture that exists in and around those relationships is really, really critical. And of course, it is an interesting proposition that the whole work from home. I think that the flexibility around that is fantastic for people, but it is starting to impact on the culture of a team and organisation. So I think for managers as well, it's about thinking, well, how do you really continue to build that, even while giving people flexibility? But you can't just be business as usual. You can't just expect that if the culture was good, it's going to continue to be good, because there's less of that interaction for people to kind of maintain and build and to contribute to the culture. So thinking about how to do that in a more hybrid working environment, I think is really, really essential. But that's such an important part, isn't it? And again, psychological safety does describe a particular dimension of culture, but I think one that we're starting to see, or certainly have come to see, is very important for a range of reasons.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I wonder if now is a good time to talk about those range of reasons, now that you've touched on it, around, why would a manager specifically spend time to try and create a psychological safe environment? What are the benefits, I guess? Yeah,
it's a good question. Well, again, if we go to the Google study, I think it's become quite clear that it's very, really important for performance. So again, high performing teams are teams that have psychological safety. And again, it's because people can talk to each other. They can utilise that independence. As Amy said, if your job is simple and doesn't actually require any interdependence, and there's no uncertainty and complexity, well, you don't need psychological safety. But as soon as there's uncertainty, there's complexity and there's interdependence, then you need it, because you can't have open, honest, candid conversations with people. If you can't do that, but you do need to be interdependent, well, it just doesn't work. So in those sorts of environments, it certainly drives performance. There's some other interesting work that shows, for example, we all tend to think that having more diverse teams is actually better for performance, that the more diverse teams outperform less diverse teams. It turns out that's sometimes not the case. In fact, sometimes more diverse teams underperform compared to less diverse teams. And that happens to be true when those teams have low levels of psychological safety. So if you have low levels of psychological safety, diversity is not working for you. In fact, it's counting against you, because those diverse voices, no one can express them, no one can bring them to the table, no one feels welcome to do so, no one feels safe to do so. But when you have high levels of psychological safety, now the more diverse teams are actually outperforming the less diverse teams. So it literally leverages your value from diversity. So if diversity and inclusion is important to you, which I think it is pretty much across the board, then you also need to have psychological safety to get the value from that. Otherwise, there's no point in really, you're not really getting the benefit of it if you don't have that sort of culture. I think, certainly with the when it comes to mental health and well-being, we need to hear when people are being impacted by work. We need to hear when people are feeling mentally unwell. But we also need to hear from people before that happens. It's one thing. Certainly if someone's feeling depressed or anxious, we want them to be able to tell us about that and to be able to respond to it and provide them with the resources, feel safe to do so. But I'd also like to hear, if I was a manager, I'd also like to be hearing about whether people are feeling stressed before they become depressed or anxious, and what's leading to that stress. I'd like to know about that. And I suppose upstream from there is I'd like to know about the sorts of things that people see in the workplace environment, and again those psychosocial risks that the psychosocial hazards and psychosocial risks, which are very much part of the new frameworks that organisations are being held to account for in terms of maintaining a healthy workplace environment. I want to hear about if your job design is impacting negatively on your mental health. I want to hear about if there are interpersonal conduct issues in the team, even before it gets to the point of being a bullying, harassment, discrimination claim. I want to hear about where those conflicts are and be able to have an open, honest conversation with you about it, or even be able to encourage you to have an open, honest conversation with the other person in the team so that we can create some awareness. I think that being able to get in and deal early with these interpersonal problems is really important. We're often really bad at it. I often remind people that there's very few individuals who wake up in the morning and come into work and decide who they, think to themselves, who am I going to bully, discriminate against and harass today? People don't really do this intentionally. There's some who do. That's a different discussion, but most people don't. And so to the extent that most people don't, then it means they're not aware. And if they're not aware, then they need to be made aware. And how do you make people aware? Well, you let them know how they're impacting on you, and you have that kind of conversation. Really uncomfortable conversation to have, but really, really important. And so I think, being able to get in there early and deal with those sorts of interpersonal conduct issues, which are, again, part of that psychosocial environment that we need to know about, is really critical as well. So, and I think, broadly beyond that as well, anyone who cares about risk culture, anyone who wants to know about risks, whether it's, again, the psychosocial risks, but also maybe the health, the physical health and safety risks, but right across the board to organisations which have to manage all nature of risks. We want to know about where things are going wrong. We want to know about when people are perhaps making some poor decisions around things to do with risk, or even around ethics. Those sorts of difficult conversations around risk and ethics are often hard to have because they have pretty weighty implications in terms of when you get it wrong. So how do you talk about those mistakes? How do you open up those conversations and make sure that people are talking to each other around those really important issues? So quite a gamut of things there, I guess. And it can be a bit of a, it has been referred to as Maslow's hammer in some ways, that, once it seems like everything can be resolved with psychological safety. I don't think that's the case, but I think it certainly can address a range of issues and certainly the ones that I've mentioned there.
Yeah, and sounds like it's got benefits for the individual and the team, so they can grow, they can develop, they can be part of this, great culture, innovative environment, have a sense of purpose, have great open communication, And then, but from a business perspective, they can also have teams that are more productive, more innovative, identifying risks early, so that you have like that, you say, that early intervention or even prevention mindset. So it works both good for the individual and the business, which is exactly the middle where the manager sits, is the meat and the sandwich between the two. So it can help all sides.
Yeah, and of course, there's always important synergy there. I think increasingly, and certainly, as businesses become aware of the ESG-based, I suppose, motivations and rationale. I mean, good business is always going to be, a business that looks after people and looks after them well, because they are your most important assets. So yeah, ensuring that, and of course, things like culture, things like communication, how people get along, relationships are absolutely essential to performance. They're really critical to that. And I think people who have worked in organisations where the culture is toxic, where there are, managers that aren't supportive, they certainly know that it's not only themselves that are being impacted, but their performance, their outputs, the business interests as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And
are you a new manager looking to build your manager toolkit? Well, the New Manager Development Program is just for you. We cover 4 modules, which is looking at what is the role of the manager, how to set yourself up as a manager, how to set your team up, and then looking into the future. We have an excellent free trial that is available to all. If you would like access to it, please visit our website today, www.manageriq.com.
Another reason why I actually started doing Manager IQ is because I was hearing from a lot of friends, colleagues, whoever it might have been, the impact that managers, businesses were having on that individual. And I did another interview with a manager who was talking about their journey, and we're talking about the significant impact a person can have on an individual, and those ongoing psychological impacts that can be quite significant for someone to overcome. So it was a huge kind of push for me to say, well, how can I help this, group of people called managers who can have this really amazing, but also kind of negative impact if not done well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, being a manager is a huge responsibility. And just to put an emphasis on that, there was some interesting data. It's not peer-reviewed data, I'll have to say, as an academic, but it is from a consulting organisation over in the UK, and they ran a survey, and out of that, the sort of the headline finding was that people reported that their managers had a more significant impact on their mental health than their doctor or their psychologist. Which, as a psychologist, pains me to say this, so, and equal to their partner. So if you think about, how important your partner is for your mental health and having a good relationship with your partner, well, it turns out your manager and having a good relationship with your manager is equally important. So that really does, I think, underscore for managers, and that goes back to that relationship building part, that you, and the, that concept of supportive leadership, that it's really about supporting people, knowing how to support them well, that really does create an environment where they can flourish personally, but also where, you get the best out of them too.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much in there that I think we could deep dive on, specific little areas there. But I think that you're right that the manager has a big role to play. Yeah. And, I just did a little bit of a blurb the other day from a LinkedIn post I was doing around, how you can actually help individuals or managing conflict within your team. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was saying is, as a manager, you might not know that it's occurring, so you might not know that those interpersonal issues are occurring, but how can you actually, I think, well, actually, it's more likely that those things are occurring than they're not. So how can you be more aware, ask more questions, and have mechanisms for people to raise those sort of things, and not just raise them, but then enable them to deal with them, for those likes of those early interventions or prevention methods. But, it's quite tricky for a manager who's got, all these balls up in the air around how they can then continue to look to their environment to actually assess, is there anything going on here that I need to actively work on?
That's what every manager says. This is great, but where do I fit it into my workload? I suppose one thing to that is, if you are creating a culture or an environment where you feel confident that people will come to you. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of your focus. you don't need to then necessarily, I mean, you do need to be aware, you do need to be on the lookout, you do need to be, you know, have your eye and you know, walk the floor, so to speak, to see what's going on. But by creating that culture where you know people will come to you if they do have an issue, and you're constantly inviting them to do that, and you're making it very clear to them that they can do that, that I think, you know, does actually do a lot of the work for you, because that does mean that, you know, if there's an issue, you feel confident that people will come to you. But one of the things around that is I think managers often overestimate how approachable they are. And, you know, we often think, you know, I've trained organisations at level where you start at this level up here and they say, well, you know, we're very approachable. It's the people above us that you can't talk to. That's career suicide. And then you go down a level and they're like, well, we're very approachable. It's the people above us you can't speak to. That's career suicide. And so I think, you know, we've got to recognise power. Power is something that exists within organisations that doesn't really exist naturally in the way we might manage relationships outside of organisations. You know, we with our friends, with our family, there are power dynamics there, but not anywhere near in the same way to the structure of an organisation. So we have to understand, if we are in a position of power, we've got to actively work to make sure that people know that they can come to us and they can raise issues, not only that they are experiencing, but I think the critical things that they can actually raise issues with us about us. You know, we might not be managing in the way that we think we are. Again, we all have these blind spots, right? We're all not going to sometimes see things clearly. I might be actually causing some stress and harm and psychological impacts for people that I don't understand or see. So I'd really want to know that that person in my team could come and let me know that. I think that's the sort of litmus test, because if they can let me know that, then they can probably talk about a bunch of other stuff as well, right? I mean, that to me is a litmus test of whether this is an open kind of culture. There's some great work by Adam Grant, which you know, talks about, you know, rather than inviting feedback, you know, sharing feedback. So we often say as managers, look, my door is always open, but of course that doesn't tell me much about what's going to happen when I walk through that door and I let you know that, you know, I have this difficult conversation with you, right? I mean, how are you going to respond? What are you going to say? I know your door's open. What's going to happen when I walk in there? Whereas, as Adam Grant suggests, well, if you share the feedback that you've got, constructive criticism, for example, as a manager, and I think very few people do this because it's very vulnerable, and you've got to really own it. But if you do it well, and you say, hey, you know, team, here's some constructive criticism I got, and here's what I'm doing about it. Well, now you're giving me all the evidence that I need to know that I can walk into your office and have that kind of conversation with you. I can raise those awkward, uncomfortable, and difficult issues, both maybe to do with you, but to do with other people, and even to do with myself. And you've now given me all the evidence I need to know what that's going to look like for me when that happens. So I think managers have to be very intentional and explicit when it comes to ensuring that they are approachable. They are creating that kind of environment for people. But if you do it, then it is a shortcut to working out where the risks are and what the problems are, and, you know, what people need to be talking about, because, you know, they will come to you if you do that well.
You talked about, you know, the litmus test of people are, you know, coming in to talk to you about issues. What are some of the other things that managers can do or businesses can do that can get them to assess how psychological safe their environment is?
Well, I mean, there are certainly surveys out there, for example, that you can use to assess this. You know, questionnaires, the sort of feedback processes. I guess, you know, it is important to do that sort of formal assessment. I think on the day-to-day basis, it's also important to make it part of the conversation. So, you know, are you kind of checking in on these sorts of things in your team meetings? And I mean, some people will shy away from it. They think, oh, if we talk about this is a really uncomfortable conversation, you know, it could be threatening to people. I had someone sort of say, well, you know, one of your workshops, Brock, you know, you asked this question and somebody said they weren't feeling psychologically safe. And I don't know if that was the appropriate environment because we weren't able to respond to them. And I felt like saying, well, actually, it's not them you need to be responding to. It's the whole team, you know, because what they've identified is not something about them, but actually something about the team and everyone in it that requires some reflection. So we are talking about the culture, and I think when we're talking about that, you know, we need to be talking about that and checking in on it, and I guess making sure that is what we think it is. Asking people some of these sort of direct questions. I think also, you know, are we hearing, are people coming to us with the bad news or the difficult stories or issues or concerns? You know, I think if we're not ever hearing any of those, I mean, sometimes you think it's all going great because everyone's saying nice stuff and everyone's getting great feedback and everyone's feeling, you know, but that's actually worrying because there is going to be stuff happening. It's just you're not hearing about it. So why not? So I think there's things that we can be aware of in the day to day, and I guess again, you know, just taking a little bit of time to check in with people, and you know, it doesn't have to be. It is harder in a hybrid environment because, you know, those water cooler conversations are very hard to kind of schedule on a Teams call. But you know, just checking in with people. How was your weekend? You know, what did you get up to? How's the kids? You know, how's the footy? Just a quick conversation, right? And that sometimes is enough. Just asking. Well, the one thing people often say is, you know, why does my manager ever ask how my weekend was? Why does my manager say hello when they walk in? Well, you know, just little things like that really can leverage and improve a few of those relationships. So I think you can certainly assess this formally, and there are questions you can ask that assess the culture, definitely. But I think, you know, on a more informal basis, there's lots of things to be looking out for as well.
Okay, great. That was a great tip around how a manager can look to create a psychological safe environment, you know, having the one-on-ones, having the informal conversations, asking people how they are and getting to know a little bit more about them. What are some of the other things that managers could be doing to create a psychological safe environment that you might not have mentioned already?
Well, I think we definitely need to bring a good dose of self-awareness to the way that we work. And I think we're, you know, I think it's, I think the statistic is, although 95% of people think they're self-aware, only 10 to 15% actually are. So there's a big gap in there, right? So we all think we know ourselves. We all think we know how we're coming across, but actually mostly we don't. So we do need to be very open to that self-awareness piece and you know, taking and receiving feedback in that sort of sense. So I guess that's also about knowing how to listen. Knowing, you know, being good at listening, listening up. You know, if you want to create a speak up culture, you need to also create a listen up culture. So knowing how to listen well. I guess the other part is also knowing how to communicate well, how to say things well. I think often people don't know how to say things in a way that people can hear and also reduce that defensiveness that might be aroused by having a difficult conversation around conduct or decision making or whatever it is that needs to be said, right? Knowing how to say that well, having the skills to say it well is really, really important. And I think there are ways that you can say things that allow people to hear your message, and there are ways that you can say things that get people up with their backs up against the wall and just feeling, you know, how to get out of there and feeling very targeted. So I think knowing how to communicate well, knowing how to listen well is absolutely critical. And I think bringing a good dose of humility to the way that you manage. There's a nice term called confident humility, and again, this is the idea that, you know, to be able to be a little bit, you know, to be able to acknowledge you don't have all the answers as a manager is absolutely critical, because you don't. I mean, let's just face it, no one does. You know, to think that you do is actually blind arrogance. So it's no point in ending up there. No one wants to be blindly arrogant. But you can be confidently, you know, you can have that confident humility, and that means that you acknowledge that you don't have all the answers, but that doesn't mean that you're undermining or stepping away from your own confidence that you're actually very, very good in this role. You know, I'm a very, very good manager who doesn't have all the answers, and that's actually probably a very accurate, you know, representation of most of people. And it's just to see it as a separate thing, and bringing that humility, I think, is absolutely critical. And I guess the other thing, you know, to really encourage people to be able to speak up is use curiosity. You know, just rather than come in and again, as part of not feeling you've got to have all the answers, you know, ask questions, be interested, elicit from people their ideas, their contributions, their concerns. You know, use that curious approach in the way that you manage and interact with people. And that actually, you know, in a sense, creates that framework or that invitation for them to be able to speak up as well. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of little tools that, I mean, culture is created by people. And, you know, the way we behave and what we do, even down to those very, very small things, does define and build and impact on the culture. And again, some of those are skills and capabilities that people need to learn, because they're not all things that we've been taught. They're not all things that come naturally or easily. Vulnerability is one of the hardest things for most people to lean into. Most of us don't like to be vulnerable, and yet you do need to be a little bit vulnerable, appropriately so. You can have over vulnerability as well, but just, that appropriate amount of it that you need to bring to really open up those conversations and relationships with people. These are not things that come naturally, so you do need often to build that confidence and that capability into managers to be able to do it well.
Yeah, and there's such a human factor to people, and managers are as human as everybody else.
Yeah.
And some of the things that I take on there is that if someone is bringing you feedback that might be related to you or to the team around how you can, once again, listen, like you say, be curious about your listening, ask more questions, and really try and stamp down that natural defensiveness that might pop up.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you start doing that or justifying certain things without really listening to what the conversation is about, you start to kind of then people say, well, maybe I shouldn't be giving this feedback, or maybe I'm not really that safe here, or whatever it is. And but it's such a natural kind of reaction, because you instantly take hold of that. I'm the manager, so I own that this is the issue, and and you can kind of be defensive. So I guess trying to know that might be a feeling or an emotion that might occur, but how you actually just moderate it and understand, well, let's just, I might not have, maybe don't even respond at that point in time if you are feeling defensive. Take it away, those sorts of things. Because like you say, every interaction is going to be an indication to that individual, how safe the environment is.
Yeah, well, and even beyond that, I think it's very much the case. It's like trust. It's very hard to build, and it's very easy to lose. It's, it's once bitten, twice shy. I've heard people say, look, I spoke up once, I got shot down, I'm not doing it again. So it actually is, those little things, those moments and those interactions really do define it for people. And if you do shut someone down, they won't take that risk too often again with you, although it'll take a long time to build the confidence for them, up for them to do that. So it is critical.
Yeah. Any other barriers that you might want to share quickly that that managers might face to implement a psychological safe environment or culture?
Well, I think some of the barriers that you might experience are, again, the sorts of experiences that people do bring with them into the workplace. So, you might be doing a very good job as a manager, but perhaps, your new starter has actually come from a workplace that wasn't very psychologically safe. And so you do need to work hard to perhaps, overcome that barrier for them and help them to see this as a different environment. So, I think people do bring experiences with them that are going to, and to be able to recognise that as a manager as well is really important. So some of those individual differences in there too. So I mean, look, there's many and they're varied, but again, bringing that awareness and that focus and just that intentional focus on thinking about this, which we often just don't. And the more that you sort of are aware of it and you're thinking about it and bringing that to the way that you work and the way you manage, I think, it will be something that starts to shift and become part of the culture. But, you can't just assume that it's going to kind of happen magically. You do have to work at it and do things to actually make it happen.
Do you want to touch on, I guess, the psychological health and safety?
The point there is just that sometimes, again, psychological safety as that dimension of culture is confused a little bit with, again, that psychological health and safety piece, which is really a broader, I suppose, approach from organisations in terms of managing psychological health and safety in the same way they manage, health and safety. It's about that, and again, the whole psychosocial risk and psychosocial hazard and putting controls in place. All of that is really that psychological side of the health and safety piece that people have been aware of for a long time. Often it gets called psychological safety, and again, there's a distinction there because it's not part of that organisational approach to managing well-being, even though it's a very important, I suppose, component in terms of how you might go about ensuring that well-being is being managed well, and certainly creating a culture where people are able to speak up around these things would enable and facilitate the sorts of conversations you do need. But yeah, they are distinct concepts and quite commonly confused. So it's good to kind of clarify, and again, it's also not that, when it's not about individuals, it's not about people can be personally psychologically unsafe. It's very much about a culture, and you will find agreement around this. You'll find people saying, yes, I think our team is psychologically safe, or no, we don't think it is. So you've got to be understood at that cultural level.
Yeah. Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Brock. It's been such a very interesting conversation, and we might have to get you back on another time and deep dive on some other concepts that you're really familiar with, or some of the things that we didn't get a chance to deep dive in today. But I know you're doing fantastic work in the research area, but you also do some fantastic work in the consulting area. If a business or a team wanted to get in contact with you to do some consulting with you, how would they best get in contact with you?
Yeah, just shoot me an email. brock.bastian@unimelb.edu.au would be the best one for a start. And and again, working with a range of organisations around these sorts of concepts and others as well. And again, thinking around culture and leadership and how we can apply that to some of the sorts of issues and problems we've discussed in the session in this podcast. So yeah.
Great. And I'll add your email address as part of the episode description as well, so that people can just click on that to make it easier. But thank you once again for your time. I really appreciate it. And I think that the Manager IQ community has got a lot of great ideas and how-tos around how they can help create a psychological safe environment with their teams. So thank you once again. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's episode. If you have any feedback or would like us to deep dive on a specific skill, please email us at hello@manageriq.com. Thanks very much. Have a good day.